Welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time now for Bird Talk, in which we talk crypto Twitter with Pierre Rochard, recently appointed Bitcoin evangelist at Kraken and one of Bitcoin's fiercest advocates, who's been writing and advising about the cryptosphere since 2013. Every week, Pierre shares his insights on his favorite and least favorite tweets of the week and breaks down his reasons for his choices. But firstly, Pierre, thanks so much for joining us again this week.
Great, thanks for having me on.
All right, so kicking off this week, we've got your least favorite tweet, one which deals with the thorny issue of inflation. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so Balaji brought this graph to our attention, and I'd seen it before. I just hadn't quite seen it like this, where it was very well labeled and color-coded. And basically, I think that one of the main issues in macroeconomics facing us is that when economists put together measures of the economy's health, like inflation, they have to simplify it so that it fits into one number. And so if you aggregate all of the prices that people pay for goods and services, then maybe you can get to a low percentage of 2% inflation. But if then you start looking at, well, what happened to the specific underlying goods and services, how did their prices change? And you start seeing divergent trends. And so for goods and services that have increased in price dramatically over the past 30 years, for example, healthcare and education, it's interesting to look under the hood and see what is driving those costs. And at the end of the day, inflation is about what the Austrian economists call Cantillon effects. And the basic idea is that as the banking system and as the government are creating new money, this new money is being spent in specific parts of the economy. And so those parts of the economy benefit from the new money before all the other parts of the economy do as well. And so we see these Cantillon effects play out on this graph, where parts of the economy that are receiving government funding or inflationary bank credit first are the ones that are dramatically spiking in cost. And then there's a trickle-down effect. Now, on the bottom side of the graph, we see that areas where the free market and technology and improvements to products and services have led to massive deflation. And so basically the idea there is that to buy a big screen TV used to be extremely expensive 20 years ago. Now it's very inexpensive. And so when you add up both sides, then you come to a number of, oh, well, we have very low inflation. But that doesn't actually reflect reality. And the more nuanced argument to make is that the aggregate inflation number is low, despite the components being highly divergent. And so we see that if, for example, the government money printing had not existed, I think that we would have had much greater deflation. Now, people think that deflation is bad, but I think that you can look at the electronics industry and see that that's kind of ridiculous, because we haven't seen the semiconductor or the consumer electronics companies collapse due to deflation. In fact, they're doing rather well. And we see that Apple is now, one of the biggest companies in the world.
Certainly, there are those effects playing out throughout the economy, and I know I'm setting you up here nicely, Pierre. How does Bitcoin fit into this narrative, and what can it do to help?
So Bitcoin's beauty is that it doesn't have Cantillon effects like this, because there is no real creation of new Bitcoin. When the miners discover, or when they create a block that puts new Bitcoin into circulation, they actually have to burn electricity to make that happen. So they're not making an extraordinary profit off of creating new money, which is called seigniorage. And so in that regard, the only way that there's a Cantillon effect is just that there's more electricity production, which obviously has been criticized. But in terms of its effect on the macroeconomy and on the distribution of wealth and income, it doesn't have the inequality that traditional government currencies have.
Given, I always just sort of to speculate out there, given the, I suppose, uneven distribution of Bitcoin, even in its current state, whether we talk about centralized exchanges holding a large number of pools, early adopters holding vast amounts, even Satoshi Nakamoto himself having close to 1 million Bitcoin in his own wallets and accounts. Does that not risk, if Bitcoin were to really take on power as a global money and a medium of exchange across the globe, does those unequal distributions not risk playing out in Bitcoin as well on the larger scale?
Yeah, so I think that there's two different issues. There's the inequality in terms of who is holding an asset and how much of the asset do they own. And then there's the inequality in terms of who can create that asset and under what conditions. And so for the first of who is holding it, what we've seen play out is that as the value of Bitcoins go up, people who were holding a large amount in the past decide that they're holding too much. And this is rather rational on their part, which is that everyone has diminishing marginal returns in terms of what they are holding. And so, for example, if you have 1,000 hamburgers delivered to your house, you have too many hamburgers, and you're going to want to trade those hamburgers for other goods and services. And so we have that same thing in Bitcoin. Now, whether the person is going to sell their Bitcoin and buy a Lambo, or they're going to sell their Bitcoin and lend it to a company, or they're going to start their own company, or they're going to buy a new house, or whatever it may be. And so economists call this the marginal propensity to consume or invest. And so that's where it is indeed the case that Bitcoin's value may have to increase dramatically for some specific holders of Bitcoin to sell their Bitcoin. But everyone has a price. And so there's always going to be some level of purchasing power where someone is going to decide, you know what, I don't feel comfortable holding this many Bitcoin. I'm going to go trade them for consumer goods or investment products. Now, on the side of the distribution and of the creation of new units, this I think is a much more impactful inequality, because when you are able to create more dollars out of thin air, what you're doing is that you're not actually creating new value in the economy. You're redistributing value from existing dollar holders, and so you're diluting the existing holders, and it's to benefit yourself. Now, it would be one thing if you were just benefiting yourself kind of in a perhaps in a neutral manner, or in a manner that is not noxious and destructive to the rest of society. Unfortunately, governments dilute holders of currency in order to finance projects which it's not these projects are a net positive or a net neutral. They're actually extremely harmful. And so we see this, for example, in what's going on in Syria, where the Turkish government is diluting its holdings, or the holdings of Turkish citizens' lira, with relatively high inflation. And it's the same thing in the US. Donald Trump has made it an explicit policy of his that he wants to weaken the dollar. Now, part of that is to finance government activities, which frankly are ending up with the death of quite a few people. And so I don't think it's a good idea to dilute holders of dollars in order to pay for guns and tanks and missiles. And especially, when we consider their impact on the environment. So I think that it's a good thing that that level of inequality is being removed in the Bitcoin system. And so we don't have new Bitcoins being created in order to subsidize, fairly harmful activities.
Certainly, it's a lot to think about on that macroeconomic scale and those larger timelines, something that can sometimes get lost when you're sitting there looking at the trees and you can't quite see the forest. But now, moving to your favorite tweet for this week, one which I think everyone can get a little bit excited about. One of the key teams in developing the Lightning Network had a very successful funding round. Pierre, what can you tell us?
Yeah, so there's three major teams working on Lightning right now. There is the Lightning Labs team, and then there's the Blockstream team, and the ACINQ group. Now, so this is about the ACINQ team. They just raised $8 million, which is an excellent sum for this level of an enterprise. And this is going to let them continue to contribute to the Lightning ecosystem for the foreseeable future. Now, I also think that it's exciting because it's going to mean that we're going to have more commercialization of Lightning, right? So I don't think it's enough for there to just be open source implementations of Lightning node software. There also has to be efforts in terms of bridging the gap between the open source software and then the actual users on the other end, whether it's merchants or it's consumers or whatever new application developers come up with, whether it's video games or something that we are not creative enough to think of. And so I think that having companies focused on commercialization and really bringing these technologies to market and getting more users is really important at this stage. But it's also important to continue to improve the fundamental Lightning protocol. There's big improvements and changes coming that will dramatically improve the UX of using Lightning. So I think that seeing this round is very exciting, and hopefully there's more to come.
Yeah, certainly, I want to delve a little deeper into that point about the user experience, because it's something that seems so critical. As useful as the technology may be, as critical and developed as it might be at any stage, fundamentally it does come down to that user experience when you talk about something like mass adoption. In your sort of research and understanding and looking at what you see and what's progressing in the Lightning Network, do you think we're still a long way off from a sort of comfortable user experience for the unsophisticated user? Or do you think that there really are big strides being made?
So arguably today, there is a good user experience if you are willing to use a custodial Lightning wallet. And so that's where I think that we have to face the challenge of keeping a decentralized system, right? That's part of why this is interesting at all. And also then bridging the gap with the UX. And I think it is possible, but I agree that we're not there yet in terms of the non-custodial usage of Lightning. And it is, I wouldn't say that it's a ways off, but I think that there's more investment that's needed. And today it's October 2019. Maybe later next year we'll have pretty clear UX gains on the non-custodial. Already, I've been impressed with Eclair, which is ACINQ's software, and it works fairly well now. But there absolutely does need to be more improvements across the ecosystem.
Certainly, I think we all need to remember the Lightning Network was only launched in beta in early of 2018. There's still some development needs to be done, still some time needs to be given, a bit of patience can, I suppose, always be called for. But Pierre Rochard, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this week's Bird Talk. And I'm going to break down your favorite and least favorite tweets for this week. I look forward to speaking again next week. And in the meantime, stay with us at blocktv.com for all the latest news and information. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.